Hi everyone, David Ryshpan with you once again for more lessons and tutorials here on my YouTube channel. This week it's a bit of a different video. We're going to talk about 5 of my most influential records in this music we call jazz. These are records that I come back to time and time again as a player and as a teacher. These records were really influential on me in my early development stages, and they're records I show to most, if not all, of my students. If you like the content you see on this channel, please click the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to help it grow. There is also a Patreon link down in the description box below if you are feeling particularly generous and want access to additional content and material. These are not my 5 desert island recordings. These are not the only 5 records you need to learn jazz. These are just 5 albums that I find myself going back to time and time again as a listener, as a player, and as an educator with my own students. Okay, let's get into it. The first record I want to talk about today is this one, Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, otherwise known as just Ella and Louis. The reason I come back to this record time and time again, with my students especially, is that a lot of my students are classically trained pianists. The hardest thing to grasp often in the switch from classical music to jazz music is understanding phrasing and how to transform a melody from what's written on the lead sheet to your own personal musical statement, especially in a way that's idiomatic to the history of jazz. And the beauty of this album is that you get to hear the melodies or the heads 3 times in a row. You get to hear Ella sing it, you get to hear Louis sing it, and then you get to hear Louis Armstrong play it on trumpet. So you get 3 different variations of how to phrase a melody in a straight-ahead jazz context. The other interesting thing about this album is the rhythm section on it. Oscar Peterson on piano, Herb Ellis on guitar, Ray Brown on bass, and Buddy Rich on drums. Now obviously Buddy Rich is known more for his bombastic big band music as well as the bus tapes. So it's really interesting to hear him in a more subdued, restrained, supportive role on this album. For drummers especially, I would recommend checking out Buddy Rich in the Lester Young Trio with Nat King Cole on piano. This record is amazing. There's lots of humor in it. You hear the relationship between Ella and Louis, and you hear how supportive all the rhythm section is throughout the album. There's a moment in They Can't Take That Away From Me, I believe, where Ella actually impersonates Louis. It's a really beautiful, funny moment. The second record, and another textbook of phrasing, is Miles Davis, Roundabout Midnight, 1956, with the First Great Quintet. You can tell by the condition of the jewel case that this has seen better days and that I've listened to it and used it a lot. This is worth the price of admission alone for Bye Bye Blackbird. I use Bye Bye Blackbird all the time to teach, to understand how you can push and pull a melody and a fragment. And I get my students often to just write down, to take notes about where Miles pushes and pulls the melody in the statement of the head, and the balance of what he plays as written or almost as written versus what he is paraphrasing. Also, Red Garland's solo on this is phenomenal and really changed my path in my listening. I had already been studying jazz a little bit by this point once I heard this record, and this record just kind of solidified the path I was on and guided me through a lot of other development in my early listening. Record number 3, Dexter Gordon and Go, particularly the track Second Balcony Jump. And of course, Second Balcony Jump is a classic solo both from Dexter and from pianist Sonny Clark. The interesting thing about Dexter Gordon is that his time feel is a little bit straighter than definitely compared to Miles or Coltrane or Louis Armstrong. It's a much more even 8th note, straight 8th note kind of feel. And the language that he uses to improvise is just a little bit beyond bebop, and there's some of the kind of Coltrane-ish harmonic superimposition happening. So it's kind of a good way to start to get into more advanced harmonic concepts with students. And the solo is just a masterpiece of what you can do over rhythm changes. I should mention the second balcony jump is a tune based on rhythm changes. So to get your students, or if you are a student just starting to listen to jazz and to study jazz, rhythm changes is the chord sequence of I Got Rhythm, which is the basis. It's one of the templates of many standards and many bebop tunes. So to hear a really good solo over the framework of rhythm changes is a good way to start to understand language, the language of a soloist, and the language of this music. I also really love how Sonny Clark's solo dovetails out of Dexter's solo, and Sonny Clark begins with a phrase that Dexter ends with. And then when Dexter comes back in for his second solo, he kind of picks up the baton from Sonny once again, and the rest of the album is amazing. Cheesecake is another classic song as well, and the rhythm section of Butch Warren and Billy Higgins were one of the house rhythm sections of Blue Note in the 60s, and for any rhythm section player, I think it's a must listen. And the added bonus is that Dexter is a phenomenal interpreter of ballads as well, and the final track on this, I guess I'll hang my tears out to dry, is one of my favorite ballad performances ever. Number 4, Sonny Rollins, A Night at the Village Vanguard. So I got introduced to this record by a pianist named Gordon Webster, who was a mentor to me when we were both living in Toronto, and I went to go hang out with him, and he was deep into this record at this point. And so I immediately went out and bought it. It's great and useful and educational on so many levels, not just for Sonny Rollins' brilliant improvising and inventiveness throughout long forms and multiple choruses of tunes. It's also very easy to hear what he's doing because the rhythm section is at once so sparse. It's just saxophone, bass, and drums. There's no harmonic instrument. There's no comping. There's no guitar, no piano. And the bassist, Wilbur Ware, is a very direct, very straight ahead bass player. He is renowned for basically playing roots and fifths. His solo on Softly as in a Morning Sunrise on this is basically exclusively roots and fifths. So for bass players, it's a great textbook to hear what you can do with a very limited amount of material, just 1 and 5, but the rhythm is what drives it. It's also interesting to hear because this is a very young Elvin Jones on drums, 1957. So this is before Elvin gets with Coltrane. This is before his language is maybe 100% codified. But you hear the roots, you hear the beginnings of what we come to know as Elvin Jones' signature style. This record also includes Sunny Moon for Two, which is one of the first blues heads that any jazz student learns. So for that alone, it's worth it. And for more advanced students, there is the tune Striver's Row, which is just Sonny blowing over the changes of Charlie Parker's Confirmation. The repertoire is almost exclusively standards, except for the blues and Striver's Row. You get to hear these phenomenal soloists, these impeccable soloists, over very standard repertoire, very standard chord progressions. It's a good way into maybe more advanced vocabulary and more advanced listening. Building off the Sonny Rollins album, number 5, this is maybe an outlier and less well known, Grant Green Standards on Blue Note. This also has Wilbur Ware on bass and Al Harewood on drums. It's also a trio. Now, the special thing about Grant Green as a guitar player is that Grant Green barely ever comped. He barely ever played chords. So for myself as a pianist, I kind of treated this record like a play along, because Grant Green is just playing single note lines. And Wilbur Ware, being a very, very clear and direct bass player, it was a fantastic way to play with a real rhythm section over standard repertoire. I bought this because of the track list, including a lot of standards that I wanted to learn at the time. And Grant Green, much like Dexter Gordon, has a very particular type of swing feel that has been very influential to lots of players that have come after him. This is a lesser known record. This was recorded in 1961, but only released in the 80s, I believe. This record really shaped how I think about playing standards and really helped me listen to a rhythm section, what to listen for from a bassist and from a drummer when I'm playing, and how to solo and how to accompany a soloist inside of a rhythm section like that. Bonus record, Keith Jarrett Trio with Gary Peacock and Jack DeJohnette, Whisper Not. A little bit of history. This is Keith's first album and first show after he came back from battling chronic fatigue syndrome. There's something about his playing on this album that's a little bit more restrained and was therefore a little bit more accessible to me in my development when I heard this album. I first heard his version of Bouncing with Bud from this record on Jazz FM radio in Toronto when this came out, so I was about 15 or 16. And that performance is what led me down the rabbit hole of Keith Jarrett. I had been shown a video of Keith by my piano teacher when I was 10. A video of Keith Jarrett to a 10-year-old. If you are a piano teacher, don't do this. And as a 10-year-old, I just didn't understand it at all. This is definitely advanced, but it was a very, very influential record on me. I transcribed his full solo on Sandu for my final jury on my undergrad, and that solo is still a benchmark for me in terms of the balance, the symmetry, the construction of it. That construction is something I still aspire to and probably will aspire to for the rest of my life. That version of What Is This Thing Called Love with the vamp in the left hand and him improvising completely and independently in the right, the version of Bouncing with Bud, which was the first thing I heard. The whole record was repeated and required listening for me in my formative jazz snob years. That's it. Let me know in the comments what your top 5 records that changed how you play, how you listen. Let's start a discussion in the comments. Once again, please like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Go check out the Patreon for some exclusive content. Stay safe, healthy, and creative, and I'll see you next week. Peace.